Hello, this is Dwayne Deason, and I am the host of the Cost Management Center podcast, and I have a very special guest here, Adam Schindler from Colliers International. Welcome, Adam.
Thank you.
We are going to talk today about commercial real estate, a little bit of an overview of not only of what's been going on in the market recently, some 1, 2, 3s of the basics, and then we're going to get into, of course, how you save money on real estate. Adam, thank you for joining us here. I'm going to always start off with a little bit about your background. So tell me about how you got to Colliers, your road, and what you do there.
Happy to. Well, first and foremost, Dwayne, thank you very much for having me on. So Adam Schindler, I'm a vice chair with Colliers International. Colliers is a $5 billion publicly traded real estate advisory platform. I am born and raised in the DC metropolitan area. Actually have been in real estate pretty much my entire career. Started with a large multinational firm, broke out with a number of partners after a few years of kind of learning the basic ropes, built our own firm for I think it was probably 5 or 6 years, and then ultimately hit kind of an inflection point with our business in 2017 and determined it made the most sense to sell the practice to Colliers. And I've actually been there ever since.
Fantastic. And Adam, one of the things that's interesting, after I met you, I guess it was probably 5, 7 years ago or so, it was interesting. I saw some sort of announcement where you had hit not only number one in the DC area, which would have been a feat on its own, but you were number one like nationally or something. And my instinct was, wow, maybe he just got lucky on a really big lease or something like that. But then every year you are a top ranked producer. And I would like to focus, this is about focusing on cost management, but you also have to, I always get very curious about kind of leadership and drive and how you produce such results. And is that just pure hard work? Is it a balance of traits that allow you to get to that point?
First off, thank you very much. You're making me blush at this point in time, as everyone can probably tell. But so I have never been number one globally. I have been fortunate enough to be top 10 in the company, I think 3 out of the past 5 years or something of that nature. The one thing that I'm good at is what we'll talk about hopefully during this podcast is building relationships and the importance of that in the commercial real estate advisory business. But also, I don't, want to toot my own horn or anything of that nature, but persistence, hard work, and determination and kind of setting standards and adhering to them. And I think, as evident by our relationship over the past 5 to 7 years, staying in touch with people, staying focused, and ultimately, what I think my peers would probably say about me is execution. I really think that I put a very strong focus on getting things done overall, and sometimes that could be to a detriment, but I really am focused 100% of the time at just getting things done and advancing the process on behalf of my clients.
One thing that was very interesting when I met you and first started working with you for a little bit, I never felt like you had another client. I always felt like we were number one. And when I realized you were hitting those numbers, I realized I couldn't possibly be the only date at the ball there. But you would do a great job of really putting a lot of attention to your various clients and making sure they get whatever they need. So I compliment you on your performance there and your success.
Thank you for that. And I think to your point there, I'm in a service business.
Yep.
So I think people in my role need to understand that at the end of the day, whether it's a 1,000 square foot requirement or 100,000 square foot requirement, that is probably the most important requirement to that particular client. Right. And service is everything in our business. And that's, that is a way to differentiate. And I think that that's something that I really think about on a daily basis is what am I doing to service my clients to the best of my abilities?
Great. So I want to move on to a little bit about an overarching understanding of real estate. And so we'll hit some basics. I don't want to spend too much time on them, but we'll hit some basics. So within this world, you have a client. Of course, you have a building owner, which is usually represented by a management company of some sort. Maybe sometimes it's directly the owner, but most of the time a management company. And you're kind of a go-between. Is that a overly simple explanation, or is that accurate?
It is accurate. I think taking a step back in terms of my role, so I serve occupiers of space in the office, industrial, retail, flex, life sciences, and healthcare arenas. There are other similar advisors in my business who only represent owners of space, agency leasing, if you would. So there, as you said, Dwayne, there are property managers, there are asset managers, there are brokers, there are various other components in the real estate services business. But my core focus really is just advocating and assisting those occupiers of space, be it large or small.
Right. That makes sense. You're the primary contact between the client and whoever is leasing the building, whether it's a management company or directly with the ownership or the asset manager. Okay.
Correct. And to that point, it's also negotiating with, developing relationships with, whether that is the asset manager, property manager, owner, or landlord agent on the other side. So I am kind of the conduit and the go-between. That's the day-to-day. Although when you look at building relationships with people, that's not only just on the real estate component, it's also supporting them in any of their other business-related needs, whether that's making a recommendation on an appropriate accounting firm to assist them, or law firm, or cost reduction firm, or something of that nature. I mean, I truly strive to be the first phone call that people make for my clients.
Well, and speaking of that, how deep do you get into it? Where do you get into how much space they actually need, what their projections are? Do you get in that whole business, or is it really the company supposed to come to you and say, this is what we're looking for?
Great question. I would probably say that the best advisors in our business, or in my business, while we're really real estate focused, I think it's all about building a relationship with an operator or owner of a business and assisting them with formulating business strategy and aligning that business strategy with a real estate solution. But some of my best clients are people that I have long-term relationships with, that I have these deep conversations with them about where they're trying to position their business and what can I do to help them better position that business. And the real estate honestly comes secondary.
Yeah. And I'm going to get into that a little bit there, because it's a pain point that I have had many a time when I'm trying to find out how much space and what I need and for how long, because trying to get that information internally, with companies is a nightmare. And I imagine you've been through a lot of that yourself, but we'll look into that as one of our cost saving strategies in a little bit here. As far as you talked a little bit about that sometimes, so Colliers can be in a circumstance where you are representing a client, and then there is a chance, and not always, but that then there's also a Colliers agent representing the landlord in that. How do you keep that separation so that it doesn't become a problem?
Another good question. The fiduciary obligation that I always have is to the occupier. I very simply do not represent any landlords. However, there are several instances where I would have a Colliers broker on the opposite side of the negotiating table. Yeah. And I think one of the things to think about in my business always is it's a long-term business, so you never want to burn bridges. Our relationship is obviously evident, of that as well. But there are instances on a pretty regular basis where there are Colliers brokers on the other side. We do a very good job. I think our shop and, several of the other large institutional shops, while we do share market information and market comps, and there is a notion of real estate information sharing. However, the client comes first and foremost, and any information that, could be deemed kind of proprietary and unshareable does not get shared with the other side, or does not kind of break that barrier between the landlord side and the tenant side. And I think you would see that across all of the institutional or publicly traded quality real estate advisory firms.
Yeah, it's not an unusual circumstance these days.
Look, you hope, and again, I would call a entrepreneurial, it's $5 billion company, but we are not the largest real estate advisory firm. But I candidly think it would be a bad thing if I didn't end up, on the opposite side of the table negotiating on behalf of clients with my counterparts in the office, because that would mean one of us is not doing our job in terms of market penetration and kind of covering the bases.
Right. That makes sense. Okay. And just going over terms that kind of come up in leases and what most of your clients will focus on. Obviously, the length of the lease, the term of the lease is a key factor. The base lease costs, key factor. The build out allowance, I always think of rent abatement, how much capital that and how much funding that the landlord is willing to give you in order to help you build out the space to your desired results. And then sometimes how you split operating costs or how you manage operating costs, who pays for that essentially. And am I leaving out any other kind of key components that I know at least, those things can be
Leases are,
but so what
I was going to say, it's 60 to 100 pages, but
yeah, that's crazy. It's crazy. What is, if I've left out anything that you think are kind of key elements that tenants really care about?
So I think what first comes to mind when you say other key items, you kind of hit on it, but lease structure, whether that's a triple net lease, full service lease, net of electric lease. I mean, there's a variety of different structured leases. Right. And that's a nuance that I think a lot of folks don't pay attention to. Everyone looks at what's the face rent, but there's other components to that are equally if not more important. In addition, one thing that I would add to in today's business environment, flexibility both on the expansion, contraction, and when I say termination options, renewal options, rights of expansion or rights to purchase or various other of those kind of forward-looking flexibility-related rights. In addition, I think security deposit has become something that has been heavily negotiated in the past couple of years in the post-COVID environment. I think you hit on all the high level with points with, escalations, rent, obviously square footage. You talked earlier about determining what helps the company determine what square footage they need. And obviously, myself, architecture firm, business planning, but getting a measurement done in terms of confirmation of square footage, because there are various different ways to calculate square footage at this point in time.
There's also in my journeys I've come across between kind of REITs and more privately owned buildings. And it can be, I have noticed a little bit of a difference in approach and when I'm dealing with one party or another. Would you notice the same, or is that just been my experience?
No, you're kind of dead on. And I think you probably have experienced that in your various roles, but, there's a very big difference between a family owned mom and pop owner of commercial real estate versus an institutional owner of real estate or publicly traded owner of real estate, or I'd even venture to say there's, various different shades, but merchant developer, someone who essentially has built a property with the goal of ultimately selling it. There's a very different mentality and a very different approach to commercial real estate versus your family ownership that plans on owning the property for hundreds of years.
Mm-hmm. And do you find one is easier to deal with, gives you better terms, or is it really not that cut and dry?
That's a great question. There are a lot of ice cream flavors. I think a lot of it is personality driven. I don't want to say that I generally find certain groups easier to work with versus others, because I don't think that that's the case. I think part of my job as an advisor in terms of advising my clients is kind of knowing the other side when you get into a negotiation, what their pain points are, how they operate. I can give, recent examples this morning of a transaction I'm working on, and it's a very family-owned organization that does not act with speed. And my client on the other side of the transaction is getting a little bit nervous because they haven't gotten a response in a couple of days, and it's also managing those expectations. But to bring it back to your question, I don't think that there's one owner who's easier to work with versus another. It's just kind of knowing and understanding the opposite party.
Yeah. I have a slight preference for REITs because sometimes they just have they're a little bit more professional, kind of have a standard approach. And oftentimes they own other buildings within the area, so that and so sometimes they have a little bit more flexibility to do something creative. If you versus an individual owner of a building, they don't have as much flexibility. They really only have control of that particular building and what goes on there.
I've been doing this for 20 years, and I can tell you I generally agree with that statement, but also REITs are, as you know, they're very face rental rate focused. Yep. And so when you talk about, and I obviously can go into examples, but when you talk about needing to restructure a rental rate early to market, REITs do not have the ability to do that because they're always forward looking. And for a REIT, 9 times out of 10, the rent always escalates. Now there are ways to negotiate / accommodate that with below the line rental abatement or other concessions, but sometimes yes, sometimes no.
So I'm going to go over a little bit about what has been happening with the real estate market since, and it makes sense to start almost right before COVID in our discussion. Let's say even nationally, and I know almost all real estate is kind of local, so we'll focus on the DC area in particular. But can you give us an overview a little bit about what has been happening, at least in the United States and in particular the Washington DC market, since right before COVID and after COVID, and how and where we are kind of more today?
Sure, I will do my best. And obviously, you're getting my thought process in terms of where we are in terms of market cycle and what's going on. That obviously changes on a daily basis. As you know, Dwayne, I'm sitting about 2 blocks from the White House at this point in time. So we're gonna start macro and then go micro. But the DC market is quite interesting. So macro wise, I would say that from my perspective, the commercial real estate market is definitely in recovery mode. COVID was obviously very seismic in terms of every asset class. Most impacted, I would say, was commercial real estate office. What I am seeing high level at this point in time is that the office market is in, I don't want to say full recovery, but we are definitely coming out of the main slowdown. And, I think we're definitely in recovery mode. Obviously, interest rates lowering, or the continued lowering of interest rates is helping that situation. I think there has been virtually no new construction in the past several years in various different asset classes other than industrial, and that is helping the equation. I think COVID hits and office becomes very challenged. Industrial takes off because last mile and third-party logistics providers and everyone's buying things online. So I'd say generally speaking, industrial, it nationally has been, in my opinion, just fine. I know if you're really focused on the industrial sector, you would say, oh, it's slowed down a little bit, but things are looking back up. And I just look at industrial as an asset class altogether that has benefited significantly in the COVID and post-COVID environment. Flex has also followed that trajectory, predominantly because Flex is single story and can be utilized for a variety of different products. It can be retail, it can be industrial, it can be office, it can be, healthcare, life sciences. So Flex space has done quite well. Retail took a huge hit in COVID, and I generally think retail has bounced back pretty strong. Office, obviously, as I talked about, has been the asset class that has been most impacted. But again, I think we're kind of turning the corner and on the upswing from an office perspective. Drilling down specifically to the Washington, D.C. market, I think DC generally follows the thought process that I just provided in terms of asset classes. However, you throw in the mix the federal government and what has gone on with DOGE and what has gone on with return to work, and it's a very different, very different subset and microcosm. I think DC office is still mitigated and struggling, predominantly because we have a government shutdown that's been 30 or 31 days at this point in time,
Right.
But the seismic shift in terms of the federal workforce, as far as work from home, work from anywhere environment, really dynamically changed the DC office market. We have had negative absorption. I could not tell you how many quarters at this point in time, but the past several years. That being said, vacancy is also at 21% across the DC metropolitan. But I do see signs of that slowing and stabilizing. It is interesting, though, that we are now starting to see a lot of the higher end product leased and more competition in the trophy quality asset class. And there are a couple particular markets across the country as well. San Francisco and New York in particular, who in 25 are recording positive net absorption to the several million square feet, which did not occur for about 5 years. So I just went on for a very long time, but generally speaking, things definitely getting better, and our leasing activity itself here at Colliers it is up dynamically over last year.
Okay, that's great. And one of the signs that I saw that I was curious to see if you're still seeing is, like, a few years ago, buildings were so far underwater with their value compared to the loans they had on them that they were just turning them over to the banks. Is that now stopped? Because whenever that happens, of course, the bank's going to let it go probably more cheaply than an owner would, and it propels the market down. Is that stopped?
That certainly has not stopped.
Okay.
I think there are still a large number of assets. Basically, if you took financing on a property between 2017 and 2022, and on a 5-year note or 7-year note or even a 10-year note, at this point in time, you're going to hit a wall in terms of refinancing. We were previously keeping kind of a track of the number of assets or office assets that were troubled and were retrading and were unable to transact. And we just stopped because there were too many of them. You would potentially see, at some point in time, you would think approximately 40 to 50% of office assets were either underwater, troubled, or unable to transact.
Wow.
Now, I do think as leasing activity comes back, you look at some of the more institutional quality owners, they have been able to either restructure their debt or figure things out, or leasing activity has picked back up to the tune, to the point where things are kind of restabilizing. But there was definitively a time period, I would say mid 23 through not mid 25, maybe early 25, where, basically, you would look at nearly every office building out there and say, you almost have to determine whether you can actually transact and whether they can fund.
I hope just for the overall market that settles, because that's a very difficult circumstance to be in. I feel for the individual owners and having to deal with that, because that, you're talking about, businesses that have been within families for generations in some cases, and that essentially not being able to survive that.
Well, so there were several assets, actually the office building that I'm sitting in here at 1625 I Street, which, just to give you, generalities here, sold for a third of previous pre-COVID level valuation.
Crazy.
And that's kind of, in my opinion, we were seeing vacant office sell for probably $100 a square foot in the city. In the suburbs, $60-$80 a square foot was kind of the norm for vacant office. But what I think has changed in the past couple of months as interest rates are coming down, people are realizing that, look, you can't build a new office product for anywhere near that amount. And so if you are an institutional quality investor looking for an office project or a flex project or one of the above, you look at replacement cost basis, and you can acquire these assets and either repurpose them, frankly, demolish them, and hit your returns.
Yeah. I think that it does. It creates some opportunity. You just can't build into that environment. But that's good, because eventually that means you don't have as much supply. It starts to dwindle, and eventually that stabilizes the market.
And Dwayne, you make a good point. So we have seen a number of conversions in the DC area, whether that's downtown DC, where office buildings are being retrofit into multifamily. There are probably 5, 7, 10 instances, if not more, of those either undertaken or in process. Same thing in the suburbs, although I would probably say in the suburbs, you have that same conversion opportunity. But I also think, from what I've seen, a lot of defunct office buildings are being demolished and turned into, whether that's row house residential or alternative use. A lot of product, the Class C, Class D office had been taken offline because there's just no viable future use for it. So, and that further helps with vacancy.
Yeah, absolutely. It helps correct the problem. Yeah. Let's start getting to some cost saving strategies in commercial real estate. And it's a tough one, because commercial real estate is a very inflexible purchase, if you will, or lease, as it will. And because essentially once you've entered into a lease, yes, you could have built-in exits. You could try to have different aspects of it to try to protect you, but for the most part, you're locked in for a period of time. And so it can be a tricky business to try to adjust after you've made some decisions. It can be expensive as well. But let's start with a very common one where if and this is very true in DC, if I come out to a suburb, if I go out near where we have Dulles Airport and compare it to what something might look like in Arlington or that area, very, very drastically reduced cost to lease. And and somebody might say, well, and why not just jump on that and take the lower cost leases and head out to the suburbs? Why does that not make sense for some companies and makes sense for others?
So in terms of locating either in the city versus suburbs.
Yes. I get, and you make an interesting point that even within, there's also different class buildings. So you could even within
there's
same
class buildings and there's submarkets with
right.
Yeah.
But so when you're talking to somebody that is interested in what is the trade-off between a lower cost lease generally and something that is a higher price per square foot.
So you bring up a good point in terms of one of the things I did want to talk about that I've seen as a trend and continuing opportunity for companies from a cost savings perspective is flight to quality and flight to efficiency. You know, pre-COVID in the, let's call it the tech boom of the late, teens, I would say, companies were leasing square footage. Everyone was in the office and they wanted all their employees there and taking massive amounts of space. COVID hits, technology advances to the point where we are doing virtual meetings and, everything is at the touch of your hand in terms of your iPhone, including podcasting. So I think companies are realizing that they can do more with less and people do not need to come into the office as much. So that has kind of changed their geographic preferences as far as being in the city or being in the suburbs. I would say, generally speaking, pre-COVID, DC was really a much more favorable area for companies entering into the market because it was central. Everyone could get there. There was always metro access. Whether you're recruiting and retaining from Maryland, Virginia, or any portion of the DC metropolitan area, coming into the city was central. I would say in the post-COVID, or I would venture to say 2022 through 2025, I do believe there was a much stronger focus on the suburbs. Suburban leasing was up significantly over DC leasing in that people were far more home oriented and had transitioned their behavioral habits to receive health care, to, be closer to their children. Just since the home became the kind of the focus of your world for several years, people felt comfortable not commuting as much out of the house and being closer to home in your Arlingtons, your Chantilly's, your Rockville, Maryland's. I will say, Dwayne, that I do see that starting to change. And I think at the end of the day, people are we are all social and want to be together. And the notion of getting together in an office, if that's not 5 days a week, now 3 days a week, people still want to be in person for the majority of their meetings. I do see DC, central city coming back a little bit more in focus with Doge as well. I mean, Doge kind of taught everyone that, hey, if you want to keep your job, you need to be back in the office. So I wouldn't say, suburbs versus DC. If I'm advising a company, it's really about the company's objectives, where they see their employee base being. And I would also say, to your point, there's a variety of different products available. There's Trophy, there's Class B, there's Class C office, there's buildings with all sorts of various amenities that really have changed the game as far as the location question.
And I remember just a lot of our discussions whenever we were trying to make those decisions, and we were always discussing where our current employees based. So we did those little heat maps to kind of try to say, or where were we trying to recruit from in order to try to say, where's our talent coming from? So you try to center around there. And then you also try to say, well, what would attract top talent? Do a top talent want to come to a dump of a building, and maybe you have to, but then maybe you have to pay them a little more to do that. And so there's a little offset. So if you have an attractive building, an attractive workspace, arguably you're going to attract better talent. More people are going to be willing to come in and use that space. And so you have higher collaboration, maybe even higher innovation. So those are the trade-offs that I always remember discussing when we were trying to decide whether we wanted to go cheap or versus whether we're willing to take a step up. And it's not always that if you go with a lower quality building or a suburb where you pay less rent. In other ways, it can cost you.
Yeah, I would love to figure out some element of a mechanism to put an actual cost associated with that for an executive. But to that same point, it also depends on what type of organization, or also the groups within the organization. If you have a bunch of computer engineers who, don't really want the nicer space, aren't going to use the amenities, that may best support your business. On the alternative, if you have
sometimes.
yeah, I mean, happy with no light and kind of, horrible space. On the opposite end, if you are entertaining clients and you're creating an environment where you are trying to recruit top talent and you will have customers coming in on a regular basis and you want it to be presentable, we are seeing that flight to quality that I mentioned earlier, where people are looking at buildings with large conference centers, large lounges, large fitness centers, large auditoriums, various different amenities to appease those employees and encourage them to come in. I think a huge change and push from COVID, through COVID, has been a lot of these buildings really upping their game on amenities. We are seeing some really interesting amenities being injected into space, into properties to get people to come back to the office.
That's great. And this goes tied into this conversation is a little bit of the remote workforce. And I remember when COVID first happened and we had a beautiful office space where we were working previously. And I remember our CEO, he was very pleased with the results of the remote workforce at first, because really we had already built the relationships pre-COVID. So we weren't suffering from those aspects of it yet. And so we were still doing well on, I would say, on collaboration and progress. And I think as time went on, some of that started to deteriorate. And so when we started, I had hired some people and lost them before I even met them in person. And particularly then we were hiring in different locations. In some cases, you never meet the person because they're in several states over and they're not a position that needs to come in. So, but that seems to change over time, where people are starting to realize that a remote workforce, while cheaper in office space, again, there's a cost to that, whether that's whether you lose that in your culture, your collaboration among employees, and executives have decided that really we're willing to pay the cost of that office space in order to try to correct those issues. Are you seeing that? Is that trend changing at all?
I think that trend / recognition of the value of the office has come back pretty significantly, pretty dramatically, as evident by the leasing that has been accomplished on trophy space across the board. I mean, people are recognizing the value of nice, presentable, higher end office space. It allows you to obtain top talent. It allows for an environment where people want to come in and work. It encourages, the amenities that we had talked about, encourage people to come back and collaborate. I would love for us to figure out how to put a value on, on the trophy office versus the Class C office. I haven't been able to figure that out, but right. I do think that there is, a large component of that.
My biggest cost issue that I've had, and I want to run this by you, is that I've been in circumstances where I've been asked to go release space, and I've asked HR, I said, HR, well, what's our projections for the next 3 to 5 years of headcount? And they have no idea. I don't think they barely know what the next year or two is going to look like, much less long-term planning. And of course you talk to some of the leadership, and a lot of times they're visionaries, and they have these huge grand ideas that we should be taking on these huge pieces of space. And I get myself into situations where in most cases, they're optimistic on how much space they need, but never in a situation where I go off and I sign what could be a 7 to 10 year lease. Have we nailed it? It has always been that we had too much or too little space, and it's significant too much or too little space, that it was actually end up costing the company in one of two ways. Either we had space that was idle, we'd have to turn to subleasing efforts and those type of things, or we were in a situation where we had to kind of augment the space with additional space somewhere else. Wasn't in necessarily even the same building. And so we were in a circumstance where our workforce started to get split until we could consolidate them at the end of leases. So it was just messy. So one of the things I advocate for, which is almost impossible to really achieve, is some level of flexibility. And I tried to do that either through, can I get a shorter term lease? Because I just don't trust where I'm going to be in 3 to 5 years. And the truth is, well, there's trade-offs again. We're back to that. And if you want, sure, you can try to find a 3 to 5 years, but there's always going to be a deal that comes with that. And so what just throw that problem out and just see what your response is to that.
So if you build it, they will come is always you have this constant battle in commercial real estate with finance on one side, who is always conservative, always prudent, never want to take too much space. Less is more, less term, less square footage, all the above. And then you have the business development side, or the field typically, who's saying, well, we have all this business, we are going to win. We need to hire, hundreds of people to service, or whatever the amount is. And there's always this constant battle between field and kind of, frankly, I think it's finance. And then you have professionals like yourself who kind of sit in the middle, and, you're kind of being directed by both sides to be prudent, but also support the needs of the business. And I will tell you, to your point, in my 20 years, there has been no time that you will ever be right on your square footage. It just doesn't exist. And I think that that's kind of a good thing to a certain extent, because business changes. For a number of these companies that you and I both worked with, there's acquisition, there's disposition, there's all different types of elements of change within the life cycle of a business. So I think the only thing that someone like me can do to assist on that front is give as best guidance as I can, as far as seeing market trends and just a better understanding of leveraging the entire marketplace. And when I say that, I mean, look, if I think we're at a absolute low point in terms of rental rates with the market poised to take off, I will advise my clients to probably, in that instance, take a little bit more space, because it just may make sense as far as the life cycle and construction and all the above. Mm-hmm. On the contrary, and to your point, shorter term lease, 12-month lease, kick the can down the line type is not always the wrong decision. You can always have the flexible contraction options, termination options, kind of those checks and balances amongst the business to allow the organization to reset and or recalibrate after a certain time period. Yeah. You're typically on large leases going to see 10, 12, maybe even 15-year leases, but having a termination option at year 5 or year 7 to just allow the business, the way that they term it in the UK is break points. So that reset.
And I've had those termination clauses before, and every time I've done the math, they are, it became to the point where we were better off trying to sublease the space than truly having to essentially buy out that termination. And the reason that is because they've come out of pocket to help you build out the space, to give you oftentimes a rent abatement, even pay your commission. So there's a situation they don't want to be out that money, and I think it's probably a fair position. And so when I did the math, particularly because many years out, we've always been better off trying to say we should try to sublease, and then you never know, maybe eventually you will need that space in that later on, where you can just end the sublease and then assume the space as you grew a little more slowly than you were expecting to.
I think 9 times out of 10 would agree with that statement in terms of subleasing. The only thing that has been a challenge in the past couple years is the subleasing market has not exactly been fantastic. Yeah. Although I would say at this point in time, it has definitely gotten better in the past several years as companies have come back and activity is back up. But, those termination options, frankly, unless you negotiate them very, very well, are intended to be painful because the landlord is incurring significant capital costs.
They're in pain, and you should share that pain. I sympathize with their position. But here, as someone who's trying to build in flexibility, one of the avenues I often try to explore, and it's sometimes like finding a diamond in the rough a little bit, is trying to find a sublease that is shorter term. And I would rather sign a sublease for 3 to 5 years, knowing that at the end of that, I might have to move. The subleases, the downside is usually, of course, you could always build them out, but for such a short term, you wouldn't want to do that. And so you really, you're not getting what's happening. You could put a coat of paint on that is good enough, and you go in there, and that's the only way to get you the flexibility I'm talking about. And it's not the sexy new lease that a lot of leadership are looking for necessarily.
Right. It's not a brand grand new headquarters that everyone puts their thumbprint on. As we're talking cost containment, one thing that I would mention that I think a lot of firms in a similar situation should consider that they frankly don't is You often see when people are building new space that they design it specifically for their use. They don't think of potential subleasing in the future. They don't think, oh, we may need to contract or we may need to build in some flexibility for our business. And I think a very big mistake that I've seen a number of organizations make is not consulting with an architecture firm to create a design that is, either A, if we're talking the full floor, demisable, or B, easily sublet. I think if a lot of organizations and architecture firms took that into account, where let's just give a hypothetical example, if a firm was taking 10,000 square feet for 10 years, but there was an opportunity, in the not too distant future that they were thinking about selling a component of their business, then you design kind of an easily demisable 3,000 square foot smaller space within that footprint that you knew, hey, if we did execute on this sale, there's a very easy small chunk if we consolidated our business back. A lot of people don't have the foresight or thought process to look at that, but that is something that I would strongly recommend people look at from a cost containment perspective.
Yeah. And you bring up kind of the next point I was going to discuss a little bit is with those architects and build outs and that type of thing, is that can be a shockingly expensive undertaking, the cost to build out, because it's not like the cost of materials are falling. They continue to rise. Yeah. The permitting process can be long and arduous, on top of that. And then in many cases, you could try to abate your, that first term of the lease so you're not paying double rent, but under GAAP, you're still generally recording two rents at the same time. So it's still messy. On build outs, is there a strategy there that to try to minimize that build out cost without compromising overall quality? Because of course you want a place that shows the way you need it to for employees. Is there any strategies there?
Well, I would actually say, to address your point, I actually am starting to see, in my opinion, construction costs somewhat leveling off. They were rising rapidly, basically COVID and post-COVID. I know we all thought tariffs were going to be a big component and an attribute of construction cost creep. Maybe I'm not seeing it. And a number of the contractors that I speak with are saying, yeah, there's been some impact, but not what we thought.
I wonder if that's because a little bit there's less building. They're not putting up new buildings, and so there's a little bit less competition for materials.
Could be. Let's hope. I think that's positive for everybody. But to better address your question as far as how to mitigate construction costs, two things come to mind. Number one, hire a professional third party or someone who has a construction background to manage that construction process. Yeah. And just like all the construction contractors bid out all of the subcontractors, the electrical, the plumbing, the concrete, tenants and occupiers should be doing the same. You should always be bidding your construction project to multiple different contractors. Yep. A, it ensures best in class. B, and I'm sure Dwayne is a procurement professional. You've seen this. Sometimes you get great ideas from a contractor that you can utilize for your project. Yep. And sometimes people will come in, certain vendors will come in and say, hey, have you thought of utilizing this product instead of that product? And that may lead to, you kind of have 3 or 4 of those throughout your kind of design and architecture process. And all of a sudden that leads to material savings.
Yep. That's exactly my strategy is always, I'm not just bidding out opportunities to try to save money. I'm bidding them out to understand different strategies and approaches that sometimes dwarf the savings on the cost side. They can either make it shorter periods of time it takes to build something out, which could be advantageous, make the space nicer or more efficiently utilized. So they can have a lot of other benefits other than just pure cost. One of the things that I had run into that I wanted your take, because I've only done it a couple of times, but I've had pretty good success with it, is where we got the landlord to manage the build out. We kind of asked them to kind of a build to suit type of strategy. And it was interesting that I just noticed they had a more, as long as you were clear on what you were looking for, and there was, and everyone knew up front what that was going to be. I don't know whether they just are better about getting permits more timely. They had already built better relationships with various contractors, but they were able to execute, I think, faster and probably I would say more economically than we could have on our own. And did I just get lucky, or would you say that's actually something to consider?
You did not get lucky, and honestly, that is 9/10 of the construction projects and projects that I work on, generally speaking, have shifted over to be landlord turnkey, or landlord build. For two reasons come to mind. Number one, most of the professionals that are operating these companies have no construction knowledge whatsoever and are not expertise in that business. And frankly, their time is better suited operating the business versus dealing with a construction process and taking themselves out of the day to day. So when my clients are evaluating a tenant allowance versus a landlord turnkey, I 9 times out of 10 will probably tell them to allow the landlord to build the space for them. Landlord knows the building better than you do. Landlord knows the vendors better than you do. Landlord owns the building and can know the zoning and the municipal regulations and the process better than you do. I'm not sitting here advocating that you don't manage that process and have oversight of the landlord's work. But I am saying that I think 9 times out of 10, let the professionals be professionals in the construction business.
Yeah. And if they miss their dates, there's more chance that you're allowed them you can negotiate a different start date because it's on them.
The landlord is incentivized to get you into the space. The faster you're in the space, the faster you pay rent.
Exactly there. So then there's one of my favorites, of course, and probably the most popular, blend and extend strategy. And, this has been every time we had the parameters that made this work, we did very well on that. And that's basically, we had a term that was within a year or two of expiring. The landlord, of course, unless rents have really gone up and they're out of market now, they're incentivized to kind of keep you there, if they can, and they're willing to cut a deal, on a blend and extend. And so you get a lower rent, almost initially going forward if you extend the lease for a certain period of time. What are you seeing in the marketplace on these blends and extends? Is this still a very viable solution?
Very viable solution. And I get it. It kind of goes back to what we had discussed a couple of minutes ago, as far as the business needs change as well. Yeah. Sometimes it's more space, sometimes it's less space. So just because you have a lease obligation for another several years doesn't mean that that's not an opportunity to engage a landlord. You also never know what the landlord's situation is unless you get an advisor to help you. And I'm advocating for commercial real estate advisory. But I would say in COVID, Dwayne, I was able to accomplish probably 4 to 5 large lease restructures where the tenants had 3 to 6 years remaining on term. So I think just because you have a lease expiration X years out doesn't mean that there's not an opportunity. But generally speaking, to your point, leases continue to escalate over time. The market doesn't always do that. And in the COVID environment, or, immediate post-COVID environment, rental rates had escalated. Lease rates had escalated because annual escalations, but rental rates had not. And there was an opportunity to mark leases back to market, reset a base year, which is your operating expense and real estate tax pass-throughs, potentially obtain some concessions because the market had softened significantly, and recast most tenants' rent for a longer term basis. And I think I would only recommend that if the business had long-term visibility as far as their needs, or there was a compelling reason from a business perspective to undertake that blend and extend. Yeah. But we did a number of those transactions in the COVID environment and post-COVID.
Yeah, it's always wise to keep your eye out on that, because it can also be a good opportunity if you have too much or too little space to divest or gain space as part of that deal. So it can be an interesting opportunity. Probably the one I've won the most on financially there. Two other that fall under the real estate category that I want to run by you. One was operating costs, where I used to have some crews that would come in there and do an incredible job auditing operating costs, and they were always on. They found the landlords always trying to charge through capital expenditures and questionable things that and they had a very good hit rate. And now when I've seen a lot more when I use some of the larger firms, they kind of just roll it in as a service that they provide. They do what they call a desktop review, and lo and behold, never find anything. What do you find on that operating cost aspect of it? Do you get in that mix?
We do. For all of our clients, we do have that a lease audit service. Every April, we ask for expenses. I would say oftentimes tenants will send us their bills as well. And if you can look at it very quickly and understand, hey, you've only been in the space for a year, but you're paying $20 a square foot in pass-throughs, there's a problem. But to your point, Dwayne, that is one of the easiest areas to identify for simple cost reduction.
Yep.
I'm not going to make a statement that every landlord passes through expenses that they shouldn't, but I would say that, it is absolutely worth checking. And any lease, my opinion, is over 20 or 25,000 square feet. That should be something that is done from a desktop perspective every year, regardless. For a lease of that size or above, even if you were able to find $1 to a square foot, it's material.
And particularly because usually it perpetuates, through the entire lease. If it's being charged 1 year, the chances are it will continue to be charged over the life of the lease.
Yes. And if you don't catch it, then the landlord typically will pass it through every single time.
Yeah.
We have seen some egregious instances where landlords are passing through their capitals tickets as an expense. They're passing through various office expenses and various property related expenses that have nothing to do with that particular property. So I think having a good audit resource is definitely something of value to virtually any tenant. We are actually undertaking a large audit for in a medical office building in DC on behalf of a collective 8 tenants right now. And these tenants have all received significant pass-through expenses where, to the tune of several $100,000. And we have a landlord that simply decided to kind of recalculate everyone's base year and with no factual basis whatsoever. So if you get a bill that really doesn't make a lot of sense, highly recommend engaging someone to take a look at it.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree. And in that same light, I guess I put in the same category is I've had a lot of luck with property taxes in the sense that that what the state or local usually it's a local jurisdiction is charging you for property taxes on the building. Oftentimes, part or all that is passed on to you as a tenant. And I found that if you can work with the landlord to challenge that, it takes a long time. It takes years sometimes, but I've had some great success on getting very big dollars back on overassessments of property value.
Yes. And I would say specifically in what we were talking about, half an hour ago, as far as the reassessment of office values, we are seeing that as an area where 9 times out of 10, and I know we're recording this, but 9 times out of 10, I believe tenants should be auditing and or asking for a real estate tax analyst to investigate and contest that assessment.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, I'm trying to think if I've ever lost on when I've done that. And there's good firms that only specialize in that. So I think and many times they work on commission. So it's like, it's a no cost.
It's a no-brainer
to look into it. Yeah. Anything I'm missing on the cost savings front that you think that we should be talking about here?
So one thing that I've seen recently that has come up in virtually every lease, and I think it's a product of COVID, is controllable expense caps. So you have controllable expenses and non-controllable expenses. So non-controllable expenses are electric, utilities, other real estate taxes is a non-controllable expense. Items that are not within the reasonable control of landlord. We had seen in COVID where cleaning and security and other items had completely and totally inflated over what would be, a normal market customary annual increase. And I am asking in pretty much every lease that I negotiate a controllable expense cap. Market controllable expense cap is anywhere between 5% and 7% at this point in time.
Yep.
But it allows tenants to keep the landlords honest as far as not utilizing, inappropriate third-party vendors for some of their services and simply just passing through egregious costs.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, when they're having those those increases are much higher than CPI, it gets those are compounding every year. That can be very difficult to manage over the long run. All right. Great point. Adam, I have a lot more I could keep going and talking about, but we've run about an hour here, and I want to be respectful.
This is great.
There's time and your time for that matter. So I'm going to wrap it up there and just with a big thank you, because I think a lot of the information you gave here is very, very helpful, and I hope that listeners can that are facing real estate, commercial real estate related transactions can listen to this and walk away with some great ideas. But thank you very much for your time here.
Absolutely, this was great.